The evening sun cast golden rays through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Blackwood's penthouse office. At 38, Alexander had everything money could buy: a business empire worth billions, homes across the globe, and a reputation as one of the world's most sought-after bachelors. What he didn't have was someone to share it with, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Alexander swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass as he gazed out at the Manhattan skyline. The charity gala earlier that evening had been like all the others: boring conversations, fake smiles, and too many people trying to impress him. He loosened his black tie and sighed. The elevator dinged, announcing an unexpected visitor. The doors slid open to reveal James Harrington, Alexander's oldest friend and fiercest business rival. They had known each other since college, pushing each other to greater heights through a mix of friendship and competition. "I thought I'd find you hiding up here," James said, helping himself to a drink from Alexander's bar. "Another successful escape from the party downstairs." Alexander shrugged. "Those events are all the same. Rich people pretending to care about causes while really just showing off their wealth. Says the man who donated $1 million tonight," James laughed, settling into a leather chair. "Though I noticed you were particularly cold to Lisa Chen. She's been interested in you for months." "Another woman looking for a wealthy husband," Alexander replied. "I've seen it all before." James studied his friend. "You know, your views on relationships are getting rather predictable. Love is just a chemical reaction. Marriage is a business arrangement. Feelings are for the weak." "Did I miss anything?" Alexander smiled thinly. "Love is a social construct designed to sell greeting cards." "There it is," James laughed, but then his expression grew serious. "But I wonder, is it that you don't believe in love, or that you're afraid of it?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of anything." "Really?" James leaned forward. "Then how about we put that to the test?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" "A bet," James said, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Something to make things interesting." Alexander's interest was piqued. Their friendly wagers had pushed both men to achieve things they might not have otherwise attempted, though never anything this personal. "I bet that you can't find someone to marry within 6 months and stay married for at least a year," James said. Alexander scoffed. "That's ridiculous. Why would I do that?" "Because if you win," James continued, "I'll give you my tech startup, Neurotech. The one you've been trying to buy from me for the past 2 years. Alexander's eyes widened. Neurotech's artificial intelligence platform would be the perfect addition to his technology division. He'd offered James obscene amounts of money for it, but his friend had always refused to sell. "And if I lose?" Alexander asked cautiously. "Then I get your private island in the Caribbean," James replied. "The one with that cove you're always bragging about." Alexander's jaw clenched. That island was his sanctuary, the one place he could truly escape from the world. "This is absurd," he muttered. "Is it? Or is it just something you're afraid you can't do?" James challenged. "Find someone. Marry them. Stay married for a year. Simple." Alexander stood up and walked to the window, staring at the glittering city below. The logical part of his brain told him this was madness, but his competitive nature was already calculating the possibilities. "Fine," he said finally, turning back to face James. "But let's be clear about the terms. I find someone to marry within 6 months from today. We stay married for a minimum of 1 year. If I succeed, Neurotech becomes mine. If I fail, you get my island." James grinned and raised his glass. "Shall we put it in writing?" An hour later, their lawyers had drafted a simple but binding contract. As Alexander signed his name, a strange feeling settled in his stomach. Was it excitement? Dread? He couldn't tell. "The clock starts now," James said, checking his watch as he signed his own name. 6 months to find a bride, Alexander. May the best man win. What Alexander didn't know then was that this bet would change far more than just his business portfolio. It would change him in ways he never imagined possible. 2 months after making the bet, Alexander was no closer to finding a wife. He'd been on dozens of dates with women from his social circle, models, socialites, businesswomen, but none seemed right for his purpose. Either they were too eager to marry a billionaire, making him suspicious of their motives, or they wanted genuine romance, which he couldn't provide. Time was slipping away. "You look terrible," said his assistant May, placing a coffee on his desk one morning. "Another late night?" Alexander rubbed his tired eyes. "I reviewed profiles of 30 potential candidates last night." May raised an eyebrow. "You know, most people don't choose a spouse like they're hiring for a job position." "This is a business arrangement," Alexander reminded her. "Nothing more." Later that day, Alexander's driver took him to a public hearing about his company's new oil pipeline project. As Blackwood Industries CEO, he rarely attended such meetings personally, but the fierce opposition to this project had caught media attention, and his PR team thought his presence might help. The moment he walked into the packed community center, he felt the hostility. Environmental activists filled half the room, many holding signs protesting the pipeline. A woman stood at the microphone when Alexander took his seat. She had dark curly hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wore a plain blue button-up shirt with jeans, nothing like the polished people in his usual circles. "The environmental impact report clearly underestimates the risk to the river ecosystem," she was saying, her voice strong and confident. "Blackwood Industries claims there's minimal danger, but their own data contradicts this." Alexander leaned toward his environmental director. "Who is that?" "Sophia Reyes," he whispered back. "Environmental scientist specializing in water ecosystems. She's been our biggest problem, actually understands the science and knows how to explain it to people." Alexander studied her. Unlike many activists, she wasn't shouting or using emotional appeals. She was methodically dismantling his company's arguments with facts, research, and clear logic. When it was his turn to speak, Alexander delivered his prepared statement about jobs and economic benefits. Throughout his speech, he found himself looking at Sophia, who met his gaze steadily, unimpressed. As the meeting ended, Alexander surprised everyone by approaching her. "Dr. Reyes, isn't it? Your points were interesting." Sophia looked surprised but recovered quickly. "Interesting but not convincing enough for you to reconsider the pipeline route, I'm guessing. Perhaps we could discuss it further?" "Over coffee, matey." Sophia laughed. "Are you trying to charm me into dropping my opposition, Mr. Blackwood? Because that won't work." "Just a conversation," he said smoothly. "I respect opponents who come prepared." Reluctantly, Sophia agreed to meet him at a small cafe the next day. Alexander had planned to use the meeting to understand her arguments better, know thy enemy and all that, but as they talked, an unexpected idea began forming in his mind. Sophia was passionate, intelligent, and completely uninterested in his wealth. She needed funding for her research and conservation projects, and she was definitely not the type to fall in love with him. 3 days and many internal debates later, Alexander invited Sophia to his office. She arrived looking suspicious. "Why am I here, Mr. Blackwood?" "I have a proposition for you," Alexander said, gesturing for her to sit. "An unusual one." Sophia crossed her arms. "I'm listening." Alexander took a deep breath. "I need to get married within the next 4 months and stay married for at least a year." Her eyebrows shot up. "And you're telling me this because?" "I'm proposing a marriage of convenience," he said bluntly. "A business arrangement. You marry me, live in my home, and appear as my wife at necessary events. In return, I'll fund your environmental research for the next decade." Sophia stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious." Alexander slid a folder across the desk. "These are figures for the research grants I'm offering. Look at the numbers before you decide." Sophia opened the folder and her eyes widened. It was more money than she could raise in 20 years of grant applications. "Why me?" she asked finally. "And why marriage?" Alexander explained about the bet with James, being completely transparent about his motives. Sophia shook her head slowly. "This is insane." Perhaps Alexander agreed. "But it's also an opportunity. Think of what you could do with that funding." Sophia stood up. "I need time to think." "Of course," Alexander said. "But remember, Dr. Reyes, with this arrangement, you'd also have the ear of Blackwood Industries CEO. Every day, for a year." As Sophia left his office, Alexander saw something flash in her eyes. It wasn't love or attraction, it was calculation. She was weighing the possibilities just as he had done. And that's exactly why she might say yes. The wedding of Alexander Blackwood and Sophia Reyes became the social event everyone talked about for weeks. Gossip magazines called it a whirlwind romance, wondering how the environmental scientist had captured the heart of America's most eligible bachelor. Nobody knew the truth behind their marriage, nobody except them. "You look uncomfortable," Sophia whispered as they posed for yet another photo. They stood in the grand ballroom of Alexander's mansion, surrounded by 500 guests, most of whom neither of them really knew. "I'm not a fan of spectacles," Alexander replied through his fixed smile. "But James is watching. We need to be convincing." James stood across the room, champagne in hand, studying them with narrowed eyes. He had been surprised by Alexander's sudden engagement, and his congratulations had sounded hollow. After the lavish reception ended and the last guest departed, Sophia kicked off her high heels with a sigh of relief. "Thank goodness that's over." "Indeed," Alexander agreed, loosening his tie. "Your things have been moved to the East Wing. I've given you the entire floor for privacy." Sophia nodded. They had discussed the arrangement in detail. Separate living spaces. Shared public appearances. A carefully crafted story of how they met and fell in love. Everything planned down to the smallest detail. "The housekeeper will show you around tomorrow," Alexander said, walking toward the opposite wing of the mansion. "Good night, Mrs. Blackwood." Sophia watched him go, wondering what she had gotten herself into. Life as Mrs. Blackwood came with unexpected challenges. Sophia found herself thrust into Alexander's world of charity galas, business dinners, and social obligations. She had to learn quickly which fork to use, which people mattered, how to deflect personal questions. To her surprise, she discovered she had a talent for it. Her direct manner and genuine interest in social causes made her popular among Alexander's business associates. Where he was cold and intimidating, she was warm and approachable. They balanced each other perfectly. "You're quite good at this," Alexander commented one night as they returned from a charity auction. "Everyone loves you." Sophia shrugged. "I just talk to people like they're actual humans, not walking bank accounts." Alexander looked at her curiously. "Is that how you think I see people?" "Don't you?" she challenged. He didn't answer. At home, they maintained their separate lives. Sophia converted one of the sitting rooms into a makeshift research office. Alexander often worked late at his company headquarters. They rarely saw each other except at breakfast, where they would coordinate their schedules over coffee and toast. But gradually, small changes appeared in their routine. Sophia noticed Alexander asking questions about her research. He seemed genuinely interested in her work preserving river ecosystems. Once, he even offered a suggestion that she reluctantly admitted was helpful. For his part, Alexander found himself looking forward to their breakfasts. Sophia challenged him in ways no one else dared. She didn't care about his money or power. If she thought he was wrong, she told him so directly. One evening, Alexander returned home to find Sophia in the kitchen, attempting to cook dinner. "What are you doing?" he asked, surprised to see her there. The kitchen staff usually prepared all their meals. "I gave everyone the night off," she explained, stirring something that smelled surprisingly good. "I needed to think, and cooking helps me think." "You can cook?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Sophia rolled her eyes. Not everyone grew up with personal chefs, Alexander. To his own surprise, Alexander found himself removing his suit jacket and rolling up his sleeves. "What can I do to help?" Sophia stared at him. "You want to help cook?" "I can follow instructions," he said with a small smile. "Besides, I'm starving." That night, they ate Sophia's homemade pasta in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room, talking easily about their days. It felt different. Normal somehow. Meanwhile, across town, James Harrington hung up the phone with a smile. The private investigator he'd hired had just delivered his first report on the newlyweds. "Something's not right about this marriage," James muttered to himself. "And I'm going to find out what it is." 4 months into their marriage, Alexander sat in his office downtown, unable to focus on the contract in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to the mansion, to Sophia. She had texted earlier saying she wasn't feeling well. A cold, probably. Nothing serious. Yet he couldn't stop checking his phone. "Mr. Blackwood." His assistant's voice broke through his thoughts. "Your 2 o'clock is waiting." Alexander nodded, forcing himself back to the present. Send them in. The meeting dragged on for hours. Important acquisition talks that normally would have captured his full attention. Instead, he found himself rushing things along, surprising his executive team with his impatience. When he arrived home that evening, the house was unusually quiet. He found Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, coming down the stairs with a tray. "How is she?" Alexander asked. Mrs. Chen looked worried. "Not good, sir. Her fever is very high. I suggested calling a doctor, but she insisted she just needs rest." Alexander frowned and headed upstairs. He'd never been to Sophia's wing before. Part of their agreement was respecting each other's private spaces. But he found himself knocking on her bedroom door without hesitation. When there was no answer, he opened it slowly. Sophia lay curled up in bed, shivering despite the blankets piled on top of her. Her face was flushed, her breathing shallow. "Sophia?" he said softly. She opened her eyes, looking disoriented. "Alexander? What are you doing here?" He moved to her bedside and placed a hand on her forehead. "You're burning up. We need to call a doctor." "No, I'm fine," she mumbled. "Just need to sleep it off." Alexander ignored her protests and called his personal physician. Within the hour, Dr. Liu arrived and examined Sophia. "It's pneumonia," he told Alexander in the hallway afterward. "She needs antibiotics and rest. Lots of rest." Alexander nodded, then made a call to his office. "Cancel my trip to Tokyo," he told his assistant. "All of it. Move the meetings to video conference if necessary." His assistant gasped. "But sir, you've been planning the Nakamura acquisition for months. They're expecting you in person." "Things change," Alexander said simply and hung up. That night, he slept in the chair beside Sophia's bed, waking whenever she stirred. He helped her take her medicine, brought her water, and adjusted her blankets when she got too hot or too cold. By morning, her fever had broken. She looked at Alexander, surprised to find him still there. "You stayed all night?" she asked, her voice raspy. He shrugged. "Someone had to make sure you took your medicine." "What about your Tokyo trip?" She'd helped him prepare for it, knew how important it was. "Postponed," he said casually. Sophia's eyes widened. "Alexander, you've been working on that deal for." "It can wait," he interrupted. "Companies are always for sale. Getting pneumonia isn't something you schedule." Something shifted between them in the days that followed. Alexander worked from home, checking on Sophia between video calls. They ate meals together when she felt up to it, watched movies in the evening when she was bored of being in bed. One night, as they sat in the library with the fireplace crackling, Sophia looked at him curiously. "Why did you really cancel your trip?" she asked. The truth this time. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "It just seemed like the right thing to do." Meanwhile, Sophia had made a discovery of her own. While researching Blackwood Industries for a project she was working on, she had stumbled upon some disturbing files. Documents about an environmental disaster in South America from 8 years ago. A river contamination that had devastated local communities. The company responsible had been Pine Ridge Energy, a subsidiary that Blackwood Industries had acquired and quietly dissolved. The disaster had been covered up, the victims paid minimal settlements with strict confidentiality clauses. Sophia stared at her computer screen, her heart racing. This was everything she stood against, and it had happened under Alexander's watch. "Who are you really?" she whispered to herself, thinking of the man who had stayed by her bedside all night. The man who'd cancelled a multi-million-dollar deal to make sure she took her medicine. How could he be the same person who would bury an environmental tragedy and silence its victims? Sophia couldn't sleep. For 3 days, she had carried the weight of her discovery, unsure what to do with it. Each morning, she sat across from Alexander at breakfast, watching him smile at her over his coffee cup, wondering if he knew what his company had done. If he had ordered the cover-up himself. Alexander noticed her distance. "Are you feeling all right? You've been quiet lately." Sophia forced a smile. "Just tired. Still recovering, I guess." But inside, her mind was churning. She had fallen into a comfortable routine with Alexander. Their marriage of convenience had somehow shifted into something almost real. She looked forward to their conversations, enjoyed challenging his views, even found herself watching for his car in the evenings. Now this discovery threatened everything. That same evening, James Harrington sat in his downtown office, a thick folder open on his desk. The private investigator had delivered his final report, and it was even better than James had hoped. "Got you," he murmured, looking at the contract between Alexander and Sophia. The investigator had managed to access Sophia's email accounts, finding the original arrangement outlined in black and white. A business deal, not a marriage. Proof that Alexander was trying to cheat his way to winning their bet. James picked up his phone and dialed. "Is everything set for the charity gala tomorrow?" "Good. I have a special announcement to make." Back at the mansion, Sophia finally made her decision. She printed out all the documents she'd found and placed them in a folder. After dinner, as they moved to the library for their usual evening conversation, she took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. Alexander looked up from his tablet. "That sounds serious." Sophia placed the folder on the table between them. "I found these while researching your company's environmental policies." Alexander opened the folder, his expression changing as he realized what he was looking at. Old reports. Confidential settlements. Photos of a polluted river with dead fish washing ashore. "Where did you get these?" he asked quietly. "Does it matter?" Sophia's voice shook slightly. "Did you know about this?" The Pine Ridge disaster. The families who lost their homes, their livelihoods. Alexander was silent for a long moment. "Yes, I knew." The confirmation hit Sophia like a physical blow. She stood up, needing distance between them. "How could you?" "People died, Alexander. The river ecosystem was destroyed. And your company just buried it all with money and legal threats." "It wasn't that simple," Alexander said, standing as well. "Pine Ridge was a new acquisition. The disaster happened under previous management. By the time I learned about it—" "What? You decided to continue the cover-up instead of making it right?" Sophia's voice rose. "That's not the action of someone who didn't know. That's the action of someone who didn't care." "I cared." Alexander's cool composure finally cracked. But there were thousands of jobs at stake, investors, the company's future. I couldn't just. Just what? Tell the truth? Take responsibility. Isn't that what decent human beings do? Alexander's jaw tightened. The world isn't that black and white, Sophia. Sometimes protecting people means making difficult choices. Don't you dare pretend this was about protecting anyone but yourself and your profits, Sophia shot back. I've spent my entire career fighting companies like yours that think money can erase responsibility. Alexander stepped closer to her. Is that all you think of me? After these months together, that I'm just some heartless corporate monster? Sophia looked at him, conflicted. The man who had cared for her when she was sick, who debated philosophy with her late into the night, who sometimes looked at her in a way that made her heart race. How could he be the same person who would bury such a tragedy? "I don't know who you are anymore," she whispered. "Or maybe I never knew at all." She turned to leave, but Alexander caught her arm. "Sophia, wait. There's more to this story than you know." "Like what?" she challenged, pulling away from his touch. Alexander took a deep breath, his face showing an emotion she'd never seen before, something that looked almost like shame. "Like the fact that I've been trying to make it right," he said quietly. "For years now, the annual Blackwood Industries Charity Gala was the most prestigious event of the social season. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and flowing champagne. Wealthy guests in designer clothes mingled, pretending their attendance was about charity rather than being seen." Alexander adjusted his bow tie nervously as he waited for Sophia. After their fight, she had moved to the guest house on the property, barely speaking to him for 3 days. He wasn't sure she would even show up tonight. "She'll come," whispered May, his assistant. "She understands the importance of keeping up appearances." Alexander nodded, though he wasn't worried about appearances anymore. He was worried about Sophia, about losing her before he could explain everything. Just then, Sophia entered the ballroom. She wore a simple emerald green dress, her hair swept up elegantly. Even from across the room, Alexander could see the determination in her eyes. She was here for the charity's cause, not for him. He made his way to her side. "You came." "I promised to fulfill my part of our arrangement," she said coolly. "This is me, keeping my promise." Before Alexander could respond, James appeared beside them, champagne in hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The happy couple," he said, raising his glass. "Sophia, you look absolutely stunning tonight." "Thank you, James," Sophia replied with a practiced smile. "Alexander, I was just telling the board members about your Tokyo deal. Such a shame you had to cancel your trip." James's eyes gleamed with suspicion. "Must have been something very important to keep you home." Alexander met his friend's gaze steadily. "Some things are more important than business, James." James's eyebrows rose. "Coming from you, that's quite a statement." An hour later, dinner was served and the speeches began. The charity director spoke about clean water initiatives in developing countries. Sophia sat stiffly beside Alexander, applauding at the appropriate moments but avoiding his gaze. Finally, James stepped up to the podium. "As a special friend of tonight's host, I've been asked to say a few words." Alexander frowned. "This wasn't on the program." "We're here tonight to support an excellent cause," James began. "Clean water for all. A noble goal. And one that makes me think about honesty. Transparency." He paused, looking directly at Alexander. "Values that seem in short supply these days." Sophia tensed beside Alexander. Something was wrong. "For instance," James continued, "what would you all think if you learned that the touching romance between our host and his lovely bride was nothing but a business arrangement, a contract signed to win a bet?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sophia's hand gripped the edge of the table. "In fact," James said, pulling papers from his jacket, "I have proof right here." A detailed agreement outlining the terms of their fake marriage. The room erupted in whispers. Alexander stood up slowly. "James," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "I think you've had too much champagne." "Have I?" James smiled triumphantly. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain this contract I found? The one where you agreed to pay Sophia millions in exchange for pretending to be your wife for a year." All eyes turned to Alexander and Sophia. Cameras flashed as reporters sensed a scandal. Sophia's face had gone pale. Alexander looked around the room, at the hungry expressions waiting for his denial or confession. Then he looked at Sophia, seeing the hurt and betrayal in her eyes, not because James had revealed their arrangement, but because of what she had learned about Alexander's company. In that moment, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. "You're right, James," he said quietly. "Our marriage did begin as an arrangement." The crowd gasped. James's triumphant smile widened. "But what you don't understand," Alexander continued, "is that arrangements can change. People can change." He turned to Sophia, no longer caring about the audience watching them. "I have changed." Sophia stared at him, confusion replacing the anger in her eyes. "When we married, it was a business deal," Alexander admitted, holding Sophia's gaze. "But somewhere along the way, it became real. At least for me." James scoffed. "A touching speech, Alexander, but we both know you don't have that kind of emotion in you. You've never cared about anything but winning." "That's where you're wrong," Alexander replied, still looking at Sophia. "I've been trying to tell you," he said to her. "About Pine Ridge. About what I've been doing to make it right." Sophia shook her head slightly. "What are you talking about?" Before Alexander could answer, a commotion at the entrance interrupted them. A group of people were pushing their way into the ballroom, ordinary people in simple clothes, looking out of place among the wealthy crowd. "Who let them in?" someone whispered. One woman stepped forward, looking directly at Sophia. "We came because we heard you were here," she said. "We needed to thank you in person." Sophia looked bewildered. "Thank me? I don't understand. Who are you?" The woman smiled. "We're from Santa Elena, the village by the river that was destroyed. The village your husband has been rebuilding for the past 3 years." Sophia stood frozen, looking between Alexander and the villagers from Santa Elena. The elegant charity gala had fallen completely silent, everyone watching the drama unfold. "I don't understand," Sophia said. "What do you mean he's been rebuilding your village?" The woman stepped forward. 3 years ago, after the river was poisoned, we lost everything. Our homes, our fishing business, our land." Her eyes filled with tears. "Then one day, this man came to our village. No fancy suit, no cameras, just him." Sophia turned to Alexander, who was looking at the floor. "You went there yourself." Alexander nodded slightly. The company lawyers advised against it, said it would acknowledge guilt. He brought doctors first, another villager said. Then water filtration systems. He built new homes for everyone, a school, even helped us start new businesses. James pushed through the crowd, looking confused. This can't be true. There was no public announcement, no PR campaign. That's why I believe it, Sophia said quietly, beginning to understand. Alexander would have made it a big publicity stunt if it was just for show. The first woman nodded. He made us promise not to tell anyone who was helping us, said he didn't want publicity. We respected that until we heard he was married to an environmental scientist fighting for the same rivers we depend on. We had to come tell you the truth. The crowd began to whisper again. Reporters scribbled notes frantically. James stood with his mouth open, his plan backfiring completely. Sophia stepped closer to Alexander. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? He asked. The ruthless billionaire secretly having a conscience. Besides, it doesn't erase what happened. The river is still damaged. Lives were still lost, including my parents. A heavy silence fell as all eyes turned to Sophia. What? Alexander whispered, the color draining from his face. Sophia's hands trembled. That's what I discovered while researching Pine Ridge. My parents were environmental researchers studying that same river when the contamination happened. They died from exposure to the chemicals while trying to save water samples as evidence. Alexander staggered back as if physically struck. Sophia, I didn't know. I never made the connection. Neither did I until recently, she said. I was studying in the States when it happened. I knew they died in an environmental disaster, but the company name was hidden in the settlement papers I signed. I never knew it was Pine Ridge until I found those files. The irony of their situation hit everyone in the room. The man responsible for covering up the disaster that killed her parents had unknowingly married their daughter. James stepped forward, seeing his chance. Well, Alexander, it seems you've lost more than just our bet. I'll be expecting the deed to your island by. Actually, Alexander interrupted, his voice finding new strength. The bet is void. What? James sputtered. You just admitted your marriage was a sham. I said it began as an arrangement, Alexander corrected. But that's not what it is now. He turned to Sophia. At least, not for me. Sophia looked into his eyes, seeing remorse, guilt, and something else she hadn't recognized before. I'll understand if you want nothing more to do with me, Alexander said, loud enough for everyone to hear. What happened to your parents is unforgivable. But please know that since taking over Pine Ridge, I've been trying to fix what was broken. Not just the village, but the river system itself. We've funded the largest river restoration project in South America. It's not enough, it will never be enough, but it's real. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Why? Why go to all that trouble in secret when it could have been great publicity for your company? Alexander's answer was simple, because it wasn't about publicity. It was about doing what was right, even if no one ever knew. In that moment, with hundreds of eyes watching them, Sophia made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She reached for Alexander's hand. I need time, she said softly. This is overwhelming, but I want to see this river restoration project. I want to understand everything you've been doing. Alexander nodded, hope cautiously entering his eyes. Whatever you need. James cleared his throat awkwardly. So about our bet. Alexander turned to him with newfound clarity. Keep the island, James. Some things are worth more than winning. As they left the gala together, surrounded by flashing cameras and stunned onlookers, neither Alexander nor Sophia knew what the future held. Their story had begun with a cynical bet and a business arrangement. Where it would end was uncertain. But for the first time, they were both betting on something neither of them had believed in at the start. The possibility of real love growing from the most unexpected beginning.